A billionaire witnessed a poor girl teaching his daughter, but what he saw in that quiet moment shattered everything he believed about power, education, and control. He stood behind the tinted glass of his luxury car, a man whose name opened doors and silenced rooms. Watching his privileged daughter sit on the bare pavement while a poor girl, thin, barefoot, invisible to the world, patiently taught her lessons no elite school had ever managed to teach. The contrast was impossible to ignore: wealth behind iron gates, poverty on cracked ground. A billionaire who could buy anything, but a poor girl who owned nothing except knowledge. The poor girl didn't beg. She didn't look afraid. She taught with calm authority, with quiet confidence, but she never crossed the gate. The billionaire felt it then: confusion, suspicion, and a fear he couldn't name. Why was his daughter listening? Why did the poor girl speak like someone trained, disciplined, prepared? And why did his daughter, raised in luxury, look at her like a teacher instead of a stranger? The billionaire witnessed the lesson end, but not the mystery begin. Who was this poor girl really? Why did she know so much? And what would happen when a billionaire finally stepped into a truth he could no longer buy his way out of? Daniel Whitmore did not slow his car that afternoon until his eyes betrayed him. The black SUV rolled toward the towering iron gates of Whitmore Estate, polished metal glinting under the late afternoon sun. Beyond those gates sat a mansion that spanned acres, guarded by cameras, men with earpieces, and decades of wealth built on calculated decisions and emotional restraint. Daniel Whitmore was not just rich. He was untouchable. His companies funded governments. His signature changed lives, usually from a distance. "Open the gate," Daniel said absently, already loosening his cufflinks. His mind fixed on numbers and acquisitions. Then he saw her. "Stop the car." The driver glanced at him through the rearview mirror. "Sir, stop." The brakes eased. Gravel crunched softly beneath the tires. Daniel leaned forward. His daughter, Amelia, was seated on the pavement just outside the gate, something strictly forbidden. Her expensive school shoes were smudged with dust. Her neatly pressed uniform creased where she sat cross-legged, unbothered by the ground beneath her. Across from her sat the poor girl. She held a short piece of chalk between her fingers like it was something precious. On the ground between them were numbers carefully written, spaced evenly, corrected where mistakes had been erased and rewritten. Daniel's irritation rose, sharp and instinctive. But it stalled halfway when he noticed how Amelia was looking at the girl. Not distracted, not confused, focused. The poor girl tapped the chalk lightly twice. "Try again," she said gently. Amelia sighed, rubbed out a number with her palm, and rewrote it. Daniel opened the door. The sound carried. The poor girl looked up instantly, not startled, alert. Her eyes flicked to his shoes, his posture, the way authority clung to him like a tailored suit. She stood quickly, brushing chalk dust from her hands, positioning herself slightly in front of Amelia without realizing she had done it. A protective reflex. Daniel clocked it. "Amelia," he said calmly, though his voice carried weight. "Stand up." Amelia hesitated. "She's helping me," Amelia said quietly. "With what?" Daniel asked, eyes never leaving the girl. "Fractions," Amelia replied. "She explains it better than my tutor." The word "better" echoed. Daniel glanced at the numbers. "Correct, methodical, patiently broken down." "You," Daniel said to the poor girl. "What's your name?" She paused just long enough to be noticeable. "Grace," she said. "No surname." Daniel filed that away. "Where did you learn this?" he asked. Grace lowered her eyes. "From someone who taught me not to rush answers. A line too careful for a child her age." Foreshadowing settled quietly. Daniel straightened. "Amelia," inside. Grace turned to Amelia, her voice low but firm. "Remember, don't rush the top number. It tells you how many parts matter." Amelia nodded like a student finishing a lesson. As the gates closed behind them, Daniel glanced back. Grace was already erasing the chalk, wiping away proof she had ever been there. Daniel didn't know why yet, but he felt it. This was not the end of something small. Daniel Whitmore did not mention the girl during dinner. The dining table stretched long enough to seat 12, though only 3 chairs were occupied. Daniel at the head, Amelia to his right, and silence filling the rest. Crystal glasses reflected the chandelier light, and touched. The food was prepared by a chef flown in from Paris, but Amelia pushed peas around her plate, her appetite absent. Daniel watched her without making it obvious. He had learned long ago that power was exercised best when subtle. "You finished your homework?" he asked casually. "Yes," Amelia replied, too quickly. Daniel paused mid-cut of his steak. "All of it?" Amelia nodded. "Math too?" That was new. For months, math had ended in tears. Private tutors dismissed quietly. Progress reports sugar-coated. Daniel had solved most problems in his life with money, but his daughter's frustration had been one he couldn't purchase away. He remembered standing outside her bedroom door one night, hearing her cry softly, and doing nothing because he did not know how to enter emotions he could not control. "Who helped you today?" he asked. Amelia's fork stilled. There it was. "No one," she said, then added, "just someone explaining it differently." Daniel leaned back. The chair didn't creak. Nothing in his house ever did. "Different how?" he asked. Amelia shrugged. "Slower. Like it mattered if I understood, not if I was fast." That sentence landed with weight. Daniel nodded, as if satisfied, but his mind had already shifted gears. He remembered the chalk marks, the clean spacing, the patience. He remembered the way the girl Grace had erased the numbers afterward, as if erasing herself. At night, Daniel didn't sleep. From his study, he accessed the estate's security feeds. Years ago, after his wife's death, he had installed cameras everywhere, not because he distrusted the world, but because silence had made him obsessive about control. The monitors flickered to life, showing the front gate from multiple angles. There she was. Grace appeared the next afternoon at the exact same time. She sat in the same spot. She waited. Amelia didn't come out for nearly 20 minutes. Grace didn't leave. She pulled a book from her bag, instead worn, pages bent, margins filled with neat handwriting. Daniel zoomed in. His chest tightened when he recognized the title, a mathematics fundamentals text. Several grades above Amelia's level. Grace wasn't guessing. She was trained. When Amelia finally emerged, Grace stood immediately, tucking the book away, scanning the area first, an unconscious habit shaped by loss and caution. Daniel noticed how she positioned herself with her back to the street, eyes on the gate. Survival instinct again. She came back. Daniel muttered to himself. Behind his calm exterior, something unsettled stirred. This wasn't charity. This wasn't coincidence. Patterns existed for a reason. A memory surfaced. Uninvited. His wife, Eleanor, kneeling beside a group of children years ago during one of her outreach projects, chalk dust on her skirt, laughter on her lips. She had believed knowledge was a responsibility, not a privilege. Daniel had admired that about her. From a distance, on the screen, Grace handed Amelia the chalk. "Show me again," Amelia said. Grace smiled, not wide, not carefree, but real. Daniel closed his laptop slowly. For the first time in years, he felt the unmistakable sensation of being watched by a truth he had not yet earned. Daniel decided the next day he would see Grace for himself, but not openly. The car followed a discreet route, cameras off, guards unaware. Amelia, sensing something unusual, tugged at his sleeve as he prepared to leave. "Where are you going, Daddy?" she asked. Her voice small, eyes wide. "I'm just checking something, Amelia," he said, forcing a smile. "Stay inside until I call you." Amelia's frown tugged at a memory he rarely allowed. Eleanor, his late wife, kneeling in a dusty classroom with children far poorer than their own, speaking softly yet with authority. Daniel had watched from the doorway as Eleanor coaxed answers out of trembling lips, never raising her voice, never showing impatience. She had believed that teaching was about attention, patience, and empathy, things Daniel had learned to acquire with contracts and power, but never naturally possessed. The city streets blurred past as Daniel drove. He wasn't used to the unpredictability outside the estate. The honking horns, thin even pavement, the small shops spilling into the road. It was a world he had insulated Amelia from. A world he had protected her from. And yet here she had gone, drawn to someone unknown. He reached the spot just outside the iron fence where Grace usually waited. Today, she wasn't alone. 3 other children huddled nearby, scribbling with sticks in the dirt, counting, writing letters, learning under Grace's watchful eyes. Daniel's chest tightened. The meticulousness of the lesson, the way Grace guided each child with patience, spoke of someone shaped by hardship yet unbroken. Grace noticed movement near the corner and froze, eyes narrowing. Her instincts were sharp, refined from countless days surviving without a safety net. Daniel, recognizing her caution, stepped forward slowly, hands raised in a gesture of neutrality. "You teach them?" he asked quietly. Grace's gaze flicked to Amelia, who had joined the group quietly. Chalk in hand. "I help," she said cautiously. "We learn together." Daniel crouched slightly to meet their level, trying to hide his astonishment. "How do you know so much?" Grace hesitated. A flicker of pain passed across her face. And Daniel caught it, the kind that had nothing to do with hunger or cold. It was memory loss and survival shaping discipline. "I learned from someone," she said softly. "Someone who believed knowledge was a shield." Daniel felt his pulse quicken. There was a familiarity in her voice that tugged at something long buried, the way Eleanor had always taught: patience, repetition, care, insistence on understanding rather than speed. The thought was almost unbearable. Could Grace be connected? No. Yet every instinct screamed at him that this girl was not merely poor, she was extraordinary. Trained by experience far beyond her age, Amelia turned to Daniel, her voice small but insistent. "See, Daddy, she explains it differently. She makes it simple." Daniel nodded slowly, realizing the weight of what he was witnessing. Billionaire, used to controlling everything with wealth, confronted by a child who commanded respect without a word of entitlement. The gap between their worlds was vast, yet the lessons she imparted bridged something far more important than money: understanding, discipline, resilience. Grace, noticing his recognition, stepped back, scanning the streets as if to vanish into thin air. Daniel froze. There was more to her story, something hidden, something earned through suffering, but he didn't yet know what. And for the first time, Daniel felt powerless. The next morning, Daniel couldn't shake the image of Grace teaching Amelia. He walked the hallways of Whitmore Estate, surrounded by portraits of ancestors whose eyes seemed to judge him, his reflection in the marble floors reminding him of the man he had become: powerful, controlled, wealthy beyond imagination, but disconnected. He found Amelia in the library, sprawled across a Persian rug with textbooks and sketches. "Daddy," she said without looking up, "she taught me to see numbers like stories. They have meaning." Daniel sat beside her quietly. Her words reminded him painfully of Eleanor. He remembered the day she had first shown Amelia how to visualize fractions, the care in her hands, the patience in her tone. Eleanor had been meticulous with Daniel's daughter, insisting understanding mattered more than results. Daniel had admired it, yet had never fully grasped the lesson. Watching Amelia now, he realized someone else had stepped into that role, someone unexpected, uninvited, yet astonishingly capable. Amelia looked up suddenly, her eyes sparkling with curiosity. "Daddy, do you know why Grace always erases the chalk after we finish?" Daniel hesitated. "Why?" "So no one can steal it. The knowledge, it's ours until we've understood it." Her explanation carried a depth that made Daniel pause. He recalled his first business meeting in New York, negotiating billions while overlooking small, crucial details. Knowledge hoarded is power, he thought, but here it was different, freely shared, yet fiercely protected. He decided he needed answers. He drove to the gate again, this time intending to step out, to confront what he didn't understand. As he approached, he noticed Grace sitting in the usual spot. She looked up, eyes sharp and wary. She didn't flee, didn't smile, she assessed. Survival had sharpened instincts beyond what most adults had. "You shouldn't be out here," Daniel said, his tone firm yet laced with curiosity. Grace tilted, her head chalk in hand, the remnants of yesterday's lesson still visible on her fingers. "Neither should you," she said. Her voice held an authority that unsettled him. Daniel felt a flicker of recognition, something familiar in her cadence. He remembered Eleanor's voice teaching Amelia to be patient, to observe, to calculate. It was the same rhythm, but tempered with experience only hardship could forge. Amelia appeared behind Grace, book in hand, as if emerging from shadows. "Daddy, she taught me subtraction like a story," she said. "You'd understand if you listened." Daniel tried not to smile. He had controlled empires, yet this girl, poor, barefoot, and known, had a grasp on the simplest, most human of lessons: patience, understanding, and the subtle art of observation. A memory rose unbidden, Eleanor standing, Outside a crumbling classroom years ago, chalk dust on her skirt, correcting a student's mistake with gentle insistence. The child had trembled, Eleanor had bent down, whispered encouragement, and corrected the error with calm authority. Grace moved similarly, but her eyes held fire, discipline forged by survival. Not privilege. Daniel's chest tightened. This girl, so pure yet precise, so young yet commanding, had captured something that even wealth couldn't buy: attention, respect, and obedience through intellect alone. He realized then that Amelia was not the only student learning. He, a man who had seen all corners of the world, was learning too from Grace, without knowing how far her lessons would reach. And as Grace finally picked up her chalk and began writing numbers again, Daniel understood the first truth of many: some lessons cannot be bought, they must be witnessed. That evening, Daniel sat alone in his office, the city lights of New York flickering below the towering glass walls. He stared at the security footage from earlier that day, Grace guiding Amelia's hand, patiently pointing at numbers, correcting mistakes without condescension. Every motion, every gesture, spoke of discipline he had never acquired naturally. He realized wealth had taught him control, but not care, influence, but not understanding. A memory surfaced, Eleanor teaching Amelia to tie fractions to stories about flowers in their garden, the colors, the petals, the hidden math in nature. Daniel had always dismissed it as quaint. Yet now, he watched Grace and saw the same principle executed differently, grounded not in privilege, but in necessity. Each child she taught was absorbing knowledge the world had neglected them to learn. A soft knock at the door startled him. "Come in," he said. It was Amelia, holding her book against her chest. "Daddy, can Grace come inside?" Daniel froze. The idea seemed impossible. Grace had never crossed the gate. She had never asked. Her lessons were outside, between dust and chalk. Something unspoken told Daniel that if Grace entered the house, the dynamic would shift. His daughter had already crossed into her world. Now he would cross too. "Inside here?" he asked cautiously. Amelia nodded. "She wants to show me something new. Something important." Daniel's mind raced. He remembered Eleanor's words years ago: true understanding requires experience, not protection. Grace had provided Amelia that experience. Perhaps it was time he allowed it as well. The next afternoon, he walked toward the gate. Grace sat in her usual spot, 3 other children around her, scribbling in notebooks and dirt alike. As he approached, she stood instantly, alert but unafraid. Her eyes scanned him from head to toe, cautious yet composed, as if she had measured the threat in seconds. "You shouldn't be out here," Daniel said. Grace's voice was calm but deliberate. "Neither should you," she replied. There was no defiance, only calculation. He noticed the small marks on her hands from yesterday's chalk, and the careful way she had positioned herself between Amelia and the street. Survival, instinct, precision all honed beyond her years. "Why do you teach them?" Daniel asked, keeping his voice low. Grace glanced at Amelia before answering. "Because someone taught me that knowledge is a shield. It protects you when nothing else can." Daniel felt the weight of her words. He remembered Eleanor's charity work, the classrooms full of children ignored by the world, the whispered lessons of patience and courage. And then he remembered something more personal: his daughter, stubborn and bright, always seeking guidance in the places he had thought safe. He realized Grace was providing what he could not: lessons beyond numbers, beyond logic, into life itself. Amelia reached for his hand. "See, Daddy, she knows things you don't. She teaches me differently." Daniel studied Grace carefully. The girl was poor, yes, barefoot, and seemingly fragile, but she commanded respect effortlessly. He realized that the lessons Amelia had absorbed weren't just academic. They were survival, discipline, and wisdom. And he, a billionaire used to commanding the world, had no leverage here. For the first time, Daniel felt a truth he could not buy: some lessons, some influence, some power belonged not to the wealthy but to those who had earned it in silence. Outside gilded walls, Grace handed Amelia a piece of chalk and nodded. Amelia smiled, eager. Daniel stood back, watching, feeling the first pangs of humility he hadn't known he needed. The lesson had begun, and Daniel realized he was now the student. The following morning, Daniel found himself awake before dawn, the city still wrapped in shadows. The hum of distant traffic faint against the glass walls of Whitmore Estate. He stared at the framed photo of Eleanor on his desk, sunlight catching the edges of her smile. Her lessons, her patience, her insistence that knowledge must be shared, were suddenly alive again in the form of a barefoot girl he had never expected to meet. Amelia appeared at the doorway, rubbing sleep from her eyes. "Daddy, can we go see Grace?" she asked. Her voice carried excitement tempered by caution, as if she knew he might refuse. Daniel hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, but this time, I want to watch. You stay close to me." He arrived at the usual spot just as Grace had settled the children, their small hands tracing letters in notebooks and dirt. Grace glanced up, immediately registering his presence. The slight tension in her posture reminded him of something Eleanor had once said. The measure of a person is not what they show the world, but how they prepare for it when no one is watching. Grace did not run. Instead, she stood calmly, chalk in hand, assessing him silently. Daniel noted the instinctive protective stance she had assumed over the other children, the same stance she had taken with Amelia. There was a discipline, a resilience, in her every movement, honed not by privilege but by hardship. "Why are you here?" she asked quietly. Daniel swallowed, searching for the words. "I wanted to see how you teach." His voice sounded far and even to him. Grace tilted her head, the faintest smile brushing her lips. "Learning is different when someone watches." Her eyes flicked briefly to Amelia, who was scribbling in the dirt, focused entirely on Grace's guidance. Daniel crouched slightly to get a better view. He remembered the first time he had tried to teach Amelia math himself, sitting in the nursery with charts and flashcards. She had cried, frustrated with numbers that were supposed to be simple. Eleanor had stepped in then, patience incarnate, breaking each problem into stories, metaphors, lessons that went beyond arithmetic. And now, in the light of the city streets, Daniel realized Grace had inherited that same philosophy, transforming understanding into something personal, something alive. Amelia glanced up at him. "Daddy, she teaches differently. She makes me see patterns, not just numbers, stories." Daniel nodded slowly, feeling the familiar pang of regret. He had always measured success in wealth, in control, in outcomes. Grace's lessons quiet, deliberate, unassuming, measured success in comprehension, in patience, in the quiet shaping of character. A flashback hit him unbidden. Eleanor kneeling in a classroom long ago, chalk dust on her hands, correcting a child's trembling mistakes with calm insistence. She had been unstoppable in her gentleness. Daniel now saw Grace in that same light, barefoot, poor, but commanding more authority than he ever had, simply because she earned it in silence. "Show me," Daniel whispered. Grace nodded once. "All right. Watch closely." She guided Amelia through a set of problems, her hands steady, her words deliberate. Daniel felt himself leaning in, noticing details he would have overlooked before, the way she paused to ensure understanding, the small nods of affirmation, the rhythm of correction that never felt harsh. He realized then that wealth had never taught him humility. Discipline, yes. Power, certainly. But not patience, not empathy, and certainly not the quiet, unassuming authority of someone who had survived without the safety of gates or opulence. And for the first time in years, Daniel felt genuinely taught. That afternoon, Daniel couldn't leave the street corner. He leaned against the hood of his car, arms crossed, watching Grace move among the children like a conductor guiding a symphony. Every gesture, every correction, was deliberate. Every glance measured, protective, precise. Amelia knelt beside Grace, chalk in hand, repeating the fractions she had learned yesterday. 1/4 plus 1/4. She muttered, tracing the numbers slowly. Grace placed her small hand over Amelia's. "Not just the answer," she said softly. "Feel it, count it, understand it. Numbers are more than marks. They are steps." Daniel's mind wandered. Eleanor had taught Amelia in a similar way years ago, sitting in a sunlit classroom with chalk dust in her hair, bending down to correct a trembling student. He remembered the patience, the gentleness, the insistence that every lesson mattered. Eleanor had believed knowledge was a shield. Now, Daniel realized, Grace had inherited the same philosophy, though molded by survival instead of privilege. He noticed Grace glance toward him for a fraction of a second, alert, calculating. Her instincts were honed from hardship. She had learned that attention could mean danger or opportunity. She measured him without fear, yet with awareness, as if testing the waters before deciding whether to trust. Daniel stepped forward cautiously. "Grace, may I?" She didn't answer immediately. The hesitation was brief but loaded. He saw her flash memory, as if recalling past encounters where adults had overstepped boundaries, punished curiosity, or taken advantage of trust. Then she nodded once, a controlled gesture. He crouched beside Amelia. "Show me again," he said quietly. "I want to understand." Amelia's eyes lit up. "Yes, Daddy, watch closely. She explains it like a story. Not numbers stories." Grace guided Daniel's hand to the chalk. "Numbers tell a tale. You just need to listen," she said as he traced the lines. Daniel felt a pang of humility. Wealth had bought him respect, influence, and control. Yet here was a child teaching him something he could never purchase: patience, attentiveness, empathy. He remembered Eleanor kneeling on classroom floors, encouraging trembling hands to try again. Daniel had admired that, but never absorbed it. Grace was demanding he learn the same lesson, now with Amelia's bright eyes watching him struggle. The other children noticed his awkward attempts and giggled quietly, not mocking, but curious. Grace corrected them gently, redirecting focus without embarrassment. The discipline, the care, the authority, it was innate. Survival had sharpened her, but it was intelligence and heart that gave her command. Daniel stepped back and watched. Amelia's laughter rang out as she completed a sum correctly. Grace smiled, subtle and restrained, yet Daniel saw it the pride. The quiet satisfaction of a teacher who had earned respect in silence. A flashback hit him, Eleanor whispering to him years ago. "A child taught with patience will never forget. Wealth can buy skill, but not understanding." He had nodded then, distracted. Now, he felt the truth sink into his chest like a stone. Daniel understood, finally, that Grace was more than a girl. She was a force, a teacher born of necessity, shaped by hardship, and able to reach where privilege could not. And in that moment, Daniel felt powerless, humbled, and awake to a truth his fortune could never deliver. The following evening, Daniel returned to the estate earlier than usual. Amelia had been unusually quiet during dinner, her mind replaying lessons she had learned with Grace. Daniel noticed. Her forehead furrowed in concentration, fingers tapping lightly against the polished wood of the dining table. The same impatience he had once felt in boardrooms now mirrored in his daughter's subtle tension, but here, it was the tension of learning, not control. "Amelia," he said gently, "tell me about your day." She paused, looking down at her plate. "Grace taught me subtraction differently today. She showed me how numbers can tell a story if I imagine them as parts of a whole." Daniel nodded slowly. There it was again, story-based learning, patience, engagement. He remembered Eleanor teaching him how to turn math into stories in their garden years ago. She had believed knowledge was power, but more importantly, it was life itself. He had failed to fully appreciate it then. Now he understood. Grace had picked up the philosophy, refined it through struggle and necessity, and passed it on effortlessly, unable to contain his curiosity. Daniel asked, "Where did she learn all this?" Amelia looked up, eyes shining. "She says someone taught her. Someone who believed knowledge is a shield." The words struck him like a chord long forgotten. Eleanor had said the same thing, always insisting that understanding protected children in ways wealth could not. Daniel realized Grace had internalized that teaching philosophy deeply. Yet he knew her experiences must have been far harsher, far more formative than anything Eleanor had endured. He decided to follow them the next day. He waited in the car, heart thumping as he observed Grace arranging the children and chalkboards in the street. She moved with a precision that belied her age, directing each child, correcting mistakes, encouraging confidence. Daniel was captivated, recognizing discipline born not of privilege, but of necessity, the kind of skill only hardship and responsibility could forge. Amelia knelt beside Grace, chalk in hand. "Look, Daddy. Watch how she explains it." Daniel crouched, careful to not startle Grace. "Show me," he said. Grace glanced at him, eyes wary, yet she nodded slightly. Her patience was instantaneous, her authority quiet but absolute. He noticed the small scars on her knuckles and hands, remnants of a life lived without protection. And in that moment, he realized the depth of what Amelia had been learning, not only mathematics, but survival, discipline, and quiet strength. A flashback surged. Daniel remembered Eleanor standing in a ruined classroom years ago. guiding trembling children through lessons while maintaining control of a chaotic room. She had moved among them like a quiet storm, firm, yet nurturing. Grace's method mirrored that approach, but sharper, honed by circumstance rather than comfort. Daniel's chest tightened. Wealth, influence, power, none of it could replicate what Grace offered these children. He felt a pang of humility, understanding for the first time that being rich could not make him wise, patient, or capable of the small yet profound human gestures Grace displayed daily. As Grace finished her lesson, the children clapped softly, not out of obligation, but respect. Amelia's face glowed. Daniel, for the first time, acknowledged silently that he was witnessing something far greater than education. He was witnessing a life forged by resilience, patience, and intelligence, the kind that could not be bought, only earned. The next day, Daniel resolved he could no longer watch from a distance. He had to understand Grace's world, not just observe it. He left the gates open and thinkable for the billionaire he had been and stepped into the sun-baked street, feeling the coarse gravel under his shoes. Amelia ran ahead, her laughter spilling like music across the pavement. Grace froze, chalk-poised midair, assessing him with those piercing, wary eyes that had learned to measure every adult for threat. "You came," she said finally, her tone neutral yet guarded. "Yes," Daniel replied softly. "I want to understand what you teach, Amelia." "How you teach?" Grace studied him a long moment, measuring intention against experience. She had learned early that appearances could deceive, that power often came wrapped in words and money but rarely in empathy or patience. Slowly, she gestured toward the children. "Then watch," she said. As Daniel knelt beside Amelia, watching Grace guide each child through complex fractions, he felt an odd mixture of humility and wonder. Every movement, every instruction, was deliberate, almost ritualistic. His mind kept returning to Eleanor, her quiet authority, her insistence that knowledge was a shield. Grace had absorbed that same philosophy, but tempered it with lessons only hardship could teach. Her life had forged her into someone extraordinary, someone whose intellect and patience commanded attention without fear or intimidation. "Daddy, watch," Amelia said, tracing the chalk lines confidently. "Now, she makes sense of it, doesn't she?" Daniel nodded, unable to hide a smile. He remembered attempting to teach Amelia fractions himself, frustration clouding every attempt. She had cried, he had scolded because he didn't understand that teaching required heart, patience, and empathy. Grace, barefoot, poor, and resolute, had mastered these qualities through life's harshest tutors. Then came a small, subtle shift. Grace paused, chalk hovering, and glanced briefly toward Daniel, not at Amelia. The moment was fleeting, but charged. There was something she wasn't saying, a story held behind those careful eyes. Daniel's pulse quickened. Who was she, really? What had life taken from her to give her this uncanny composure? He thought of Eleanor again, of the orphan children she had helped, and the ways she had nurtured resilience. Daniel's chest tightened as he realized that Grace was not merely teaching Amelia. She was teaching him patience, humility, understanding the things money had never bought him. "Grace," he began carefully, "how did you learn to do this?" Grace looked away, just a flicker, but Daniel caught it, a memory of cold nights, empty plates, the survival instincts of a child navigating a world that had given her nothing. Her voice, when it came, was measured, quiet, but carried weight far beyond her years. "Someone taught me that knowledge can protect you when nothing else can," she said. Daniel's throat tightened. He knew, finally, that this wasn't just teaching. This was survival passed down through intellect and patience, distilled into lessons he had never experienced. And the realization hit him like a jolt. He, a man who had controlled empires, was learning from a barefoot child in the street. Amelia beamed at her chalkboard. Daniel felt something shift inside, a humility, a recognition, and an unspoken promise that he would never view knowledge or wealth the same way again. Grace had opened a door he hadn't known existed, and he couldn't step back now. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows. Daniel watched, silent and attentive, knowing the next lesson might not be numbers, it might be truth. Daniel stayed longer than he had intended. The shadows stretched across the street, painting the chalk-dusted children in a golden hue. Grace guided Amelia through a final lesson for the day, her voice calm, measured, precise the authority of someone who had lived through scarcity, who had learned to teach as a shield. As survival, Daniel noticed every detail, the small scars along Grace's knuckles. Her posture poised but protective, her eyes constantly scanning not for danger from him, but from the world that had taught her to expect betrayal. Something stirred inside him, a recognition he couldn't yet name. "Look at it like a story, Daddy," Amelia whispered, nudging him. "Numbers aren't just numbers, they're paths." Daniel nodded, tracing the chalk with careful attention. He remembered Eleanor kneeling in a ruined classroom years ago, guiding trembling hands, correcting mistakes, instilling understanding. And he saw it again in Grace, but sharpened, honed through life's hardest lessons. Her calm authority wasn't inherited, it was forged. Finally, he spoke. "Grace, I need to know. Who taught you? Where did you learn this?" Grace hesitated. Her gaze flicked briefly to the street, then back to Daniel. For a moment, he feared she would refuse to answer. Then she spoke, voice low but steady. "My father. He was a teacher. Not here, not rich. But he believed knowledge was everything. Passed it to me before he disappeared." Daniel's heart skipped. Something in her eyes, something familiar, ignited recognition buried deep in memory. The careful precision, the patient guidance, the insistence that understanding mattered more than speed. It mirrored Eleanor. Yet it was different. Sharper. Survival-hone. Double quotes Grace. He said softly, leaning forward. "I understand now. You weren't just teaching Amelia. You were teaching me." She said nothing, but the faintest smile brushed her lips. Amelia looked up at him, beaming, unaware of the storm of revelation swirling between the adults. Daniel exhaled slowly, the weight of realization settling in. Wealth had bought him power, influence, respect, but none of it had taught him patience, humility, or the profound lesson of quiet authority earned through hardship. Grace had. And in that moment, the billionaire felt powerless and grateful. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Would you come inside? Let me show you there are other ways to use this gift of yours. Ways that can change more than just one child's life." Grace's eyes flicked to Amelia, then back to Daniel. There was a pause, measured, loaded, almost imperceptible. Then she nodded. As they walked toward the gate, Daniel realized something else. Grace had entered his life not as a servant, not as a charity case, but as a teacher, a guide. A reminder that even the richest, most powerful men could still be students in the school of life. The gates closed behind them slowly, but Daniel knew the real doors had already opened. Doors he could not buy, could not control, could not even fully understand yet. Doors that led to transformation, revelation, and most importantly a truth he had long ignored. Wisdom and courage often come from the unlikeliest of teachers. And as Amelia held Grace's hand, smiling, Daniel knew this was just the beginning. The billionaire had witnessed a poor girl teaching his daughter, and what happened next would change everything he believed about power, privilege, and the lessons that truly mattered.